There was a video that I had seen shared recently that had gone viral, and it has been part of what I believe is a TikTok trend that has even been making news headlines. And the particular one that I had heard about and had seen featured a couple who has committed themselves to the DINK lifestyle, which at this point I'm not sure if that's a euphemism or a pejorative, but if you don't know what it is, it's an acronym which stands for double income no... Sorry, I'm going off the frame here. Kids. Actually, maybe that's appropriate if the kids are out of the frame. And in this video, they were extolling all the reasons why their life is one to be envied, with all the great privileges and the benefits that they get to enjoy as a result of this lifestyle choice. And what struck me about it was, unfortunately, just how superficial and self-centered all of the privileges and benefits that they had identified were. It was things like, we have more money, we can go on vacations whenever we want, we can go on dates whenever we want. It was all the satisfaction that is derived from these modern false notions of freedom. But it's not really freedom, it's more like license to do whatever you want. It's sort of like what happens to children when their teachers or parents or caregivers leave the room. They haven't suddenly acquired new powers of freedom, just the loss of certain restrictions, most of which were probably there for their own good. And it strikes me as a bit ironic because it's not like they're telling parents or people with kids something that they don't know, as if, oh, you're right. If we hadn't had all those kids, we would have had more money. We didn't think of that. It's like, yeah, we knew what we were sacrificing when we went into this, but we sacrificed those things for some greater good. And the reason that I would accuse them of relying on superficial motives is because it all seems to just boil down to the seeking of pleasure and the satisfaction of our appetites. But what's a little curious about that is that sometimes for people like my wife and I who have chosen to have children, or in our case, lots of children, we're sometimes accused of doing the same thing, that we're just making this choice to have kids for selfish reasons. Like, what about the environment and the planet and overpopulation? What a selfish thing it is to do to create so much strain upon our resources. As if we're just motivated by our appetites and our desires in the same way that the DINKs are. We just happen to want something different. But honestly, I have to object to parenthood being framed this way, because while yes, there might be a degree of desire to have children for some people, it isn't merely that. It isn't merely the satisfaction of our appetites, as in, I just want this thing so bad, so I'm going to do whatever I have to realize the fulfillment of this longing I have for children. In my case, I certainly didn't have anything like a strong desire that won out against other competing desires because of its greater intensity. In my case, there was a lot within the range of my desires and emotions that would have discouraged me from having kids, like fear, for example. Fear of the loss of all the things that the DINKs brag about as being the great satisfaction of their lives. The loss of freedom, for example. Fear of the health risks for my wife. Fear of having to provide for a growing family. Fear of being a dad and not being able to teach them and mentor them in all the ways that they need. After all, I want my kids to be better than I am. But how can I give them that? How can I give them something that I don't have? So again, for me, having kids wasn't going to be the satisfaction of this strong desire. For me, it was a deeply moral decision in which I had to weigh the different potentials, both positive and possibly negative, in which I had to put my trust in certain moral principles that I had committed to prior to this particular discernment, in which I had to put my trust in other people like my wife and medical professionals and our extended family, in which I knew that I was going to have to commit myself to becoming a better person, the kind of person who wouldn't be a negligent or inadequate father. I also felt like I had to trust my ancestors, generations going back to time immemorial, who have identified this vocation as a noble lifestyle, one that, while difficult, obviously, will ultimately be spiritually and morally fulfilling. And so for me, this was a discernment and a consideration of all these competing variables. It was a rationally chosen direction for my life based on the conclusions from that discernment. And that's what moral deliberation should look like. Your moral choices should never be the outcome of some greater desire or appetite winning out against weaker ones, because to be a good and moral person, you have to be consistent. So if you say to yourself that caring for the environment and fighting against racism are beliefs and causes that you ought to stand for, well, what happens if on a particular day you have an altercation with somebody who belongs to an ethnic minority, and they've injured you, or they've been cruel to you in some way, and you find yourself in a position in which you want to injure them back? You have this strong desire rising up in you because of the way that they've treated you. What prevents you from taking the easy road to satisfying this new desire, like using a racial slur or being condescending towards their community? Or what if caring for the environment suddenly becomes extremely expensive or inconvenient for you? What if it means that you can't travel anymore or pay your utility bills anymore? At that point, it's no longer the fulfillment of some strong desire you have to care for the environment. Now it's something you actually have to make sacrifices to meet. Morality requires consistency. It means that you have to do the same thing that you did yesterday and the day before, when it might have felt good and was convenient to you, but now has become inconvenient and possibly even a source of suffering. That's incompatible with a lifestyle that is always seeking the fulfillment of your desires, because your desires fluctuate by circumstance and even their own fickle nature. What you desire today, you may not desire tomorrow, and this becomes the absolute fatal flaw in the pursuit of the DINK lifestyle as it was promoted in that video. Because in only pursuing what they want, they neglect the fact that what they want is not going to remain consistent, as all desires fluctuate. Perhaps in 10 or 20 years from now, they will discover that the prospect of living and dying alone is terrifying and hopelessly depressing. They probably don't want to end up on their deathbed and look back, and the only thing that they can say is, I did it my way. I drank the drinks. I spent the money. I went on the vacations. I sought the pleasures. And now I'm satisfied. Or do you think that they're going to regret not doing more of those noble things that all of human civilization has encouraged us to do? The kinds of things that novelists and screenwriters tell their stories about. One of which is multiplying love in your life. Parenthood perhaps being one of the most profound ways that you can literally multiply the personalities that can love and be loved. The childless hedonist drifting through life, chasing after pleasures that are only becoming more insignificant and diminishing with each rehearsal, is never going to be the protagonist in some great novel unless it's a tragedy or a cautionary tale. Because again, what if those passions and those desires and those emotions betray you, and then at 45 years old, you suddenly realize, maybe I do want kids? What if your desires flip the script on you at a time when it's probably too late to adjust your behavior? This was the experience of Melissa Persling, who wrote a viral article for Business Insider recently. She followed her desires and her passions as a young lady. She was married to someone based on what she wanted and what her passions were directing her to do. She said she didn't want kids, again, following those same passions. She wanted a fulfilling career and the promises of material satisfaction. So she went after those things. Unfortunately, the marriage didn't work out because of the competing passions and desires of the two spouses, especially as it relates to this question of having kids. So then she went and found someone who had the same desires as her, who wasn't interested in having kids. Then one day, as she got a little older and the sands of fertility were imposing their own finite nature on her prospects, she looked at that hourglass and realized, as difficult as it was to admit to herself, that she now wanted children. Her desires had shifted on her unexpectedly, as all desires are in the habit of doing. And now her new resolution is to follow this new arrangement of desires. I didn't feel like I got a strong indication from her that her hope was to understand this new impulse and then to live within that understanding as a moral precept, but simply to follow this new desire, which, if that's the only reason she can come up with to have children, I can promise her that this new configuration of desires will once again betray her. Because having children gets hard. It's probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And the only thing that nurtures you through that experience is the moral conviction and the resolutions to do something good and noble that makes the self-sacrifice and the suffering worthwhile. Because your passions, your emotions, and your appetites, they will abandon you in those moments in which suffering is required. All you'll be left with is the moral impulse and the convictions that you adopted when you were not under this distress because of the sacrifices that you now have to make in order to abide by those moral convictions. So the lesson here is for us to learn to be moral people, to put one foot in front of the other when the terrain is smooth and accommodating and convenient, and to continue putting one foot in front of the other when the terrain presents obstacles, adversities, and suffering. To not shirk from the path that we have determined is the right path, whether we're enjoying it or not, unless we determine that it is the wrong path because of a mistake in our moral reasoning, and not because our emotions and passions are revealing their own vacillating and fickle nature and now petitioning us to abandon our better senses. If you're a Catholic who is a leader in your profession and you're like me, you probably had some desire for more opportunities to network with other Catholic professional leaders in order to help each other grow professionally, spiritually, and economically. Because this is exactly what we're doing with Fisher's Network. We're mobilizing Catholic professionals and economic leaders into local crews so that they can better support one another in the hopes of building up something like a local Catholic economy. As they do so, they can better support their parish in a variety of ways. Imagine as a parish having a group of experts you can turn to for advice and support on business decisions that have to be made. This is why pastors participate in our crews as well. They get business mentorship while having the opportunity to build up leaders in their community. So if this sounds like a way to strengthen your local Catholic community or parish, consider becoming a member by visiting fishersnetwork.com.